My name is Sheikh Abdullah Al-Harbi, and I am 57 years old. For most of my life, people believed I was a man who understood God better than they did. For more than 30 years, I stood behind the pulpit of a great mosque in Saudi Arabia, preaching obedience, fear, and devotion. Thousands listened when I spoke. Young students traveled from distant towns just to sit on the carpets before me and write down every word I said. Fathers brought their sons so I could teach them the Quran, at the same way my father had taught me. To the outside world, I was a man of certainty, a man of authority, a man whose faith could never be shaken. But today, I am telling you something very different. I am telling you the truth about the man behind the robe and the turban, because everything people believed about me changed the night my heart stopped beating. Before I tell you about that night, you must understand the life I lived before it. And I was born into a deeply religious family in a quiet Saudi city where the call to prayer echoed through the streets 5 times a day. My father was not simply a religious man, he was a respected Islamic scholar whose words carried weight among clerics and leaders. Religion was not something we practiced occasionally in our home. It was the air we breathed. I remember being 6 years old, sitting cross-legged on the floor of our living room while my father held the Quran in his hands, correcting my recitation again and again. If I hesitated even slightly, he would pause and look at me with serious eyes. "Abdullah," he would say, "the words of Allah are perfect, so your recitation must also be careful." I wanted to make him proud more than anything else. So I memorized verses every morning before school and every evening after dinner. Weekends were spent inside the mosque, repeating passages until my throat became dry. By the time I was 12 years old, and I had memorized the entire Quran, word for word, our community celebrated my achievement. Men congratulated my father and said, "Your son will become a great scholar one day." My father would smile and place his hand firmly on my shoulder, but inside me there was something I did not know how to explain. It was not rebellion, and it was not disbelief. It was simply questions. Quiet, small questions that appeared in my mind when I was alone. The questions that no one around me ever seemed willing to ask. I learned very early that questions were dangerous. In our world, doubt was not curiosity, doubt was betrayal. So I buried my questions deep inside my heart and continued walking the path that had already been chosen for me. Islamic University, years of study, long nights memorizing law, theology, and tradition. Eventually, I became an imam. Then, after many years of service, and I was appointed Chief Imam of one of the largest mosques in my region, I had influence, respect, and authority. When I walked across the mosque courtyard after Friday prayer, men stood up to greet me. Students kissed my hand. Families asked me to bless their children. To them, I was a man who had no uncertainty at all. But inside, something was quietly changing. Sometimes, after delivering a powerful sermon about submission to God, I would return home late at night, sit alone in the dark, and feel a strange emptiness. I prayed, I fasted, I studied, I taught, yet something inside me kept whispering a question that frightened me. Why did God still feel so distant? I never spoke those words aloud, not to my father, not to my colleagues, not even to my wife, because a religious leader admitting uncertainty would destroy everything, my position, my reputation, my entire identity. So I continued preaching certainty while secretly wrestling with silence. Years passed, and my sermons grew more passionate, my reputation grew stronger, but the quiet unrest in my heart grew with it until the night came when everything changed. Before I tell you what happened, I want to ask you something. If stories like this matter to you, if testimonies about searching for truth mean something to your heart, then please subscribe to this channel, like the video, and share it with someone who may need to hear it. because there are many people in this world who are afraid to tell their story. For many years, I believed I would take my secrets to the grave. In a strange way, I did, because the man I used to be never returned after that night. The night my heart stopped, something happened that changed my understanding of God, life, and eternity forever. The mosque was always quiet before dawn. The marble floors were cool beneath my feet, and the air carried the faint scent of old books and incense. And those early hours were when I felt most like the man people believed I was, a servant of God, a guide for those searching for truth. Students would gather around me in small circles, their notebooks open, their eyes filled with admiration. I taught them the verses I had memorized as a boy and the rulings I had studied for decades. I explained what was lawful and what was forbidden, what was pure and what was sinful. To them, my words carried certainty, but inside my heart, the certainty had begun to fade. In our world, faith was not something to question. Faith was obedience, and obedience meant silence. If someone asked too many questions, people whispered about him. They said his heart was weak. They said Satan had entered his thoughts. So men learned quickly to hide their doubts. I learned that lesson long before I became an imam. Yet the longer I preached, the more I began to notice something strange. Fear surrounded everything we taught. Fear of punishment, and fear of shame, fear of disappointing God. I remember one sermon in particular when the mosque was full and the heat of the afternoon pressed through the open windows. I spoke about the day of judgment, describing fire and torment in vivid detail. The men sitting before me nodded with serious faces. When the prayer ended, many approached me to thank me for reminding them of God's justice. But when I returned home that evening, I sat in silence, thinking about the fear in their eyes. To a quiet voice inside me asked a question I had never allowed myself to consider. Why does faith rely so much on fear? I tried to dismiss the thought as temptation, yet questions continued appearing in my mind, especially when I studied late at night. Sometimes I noticed passages that seemed to contradict others. Sometimes I remembered prayers that had never been answered, no matter how sincerely people begged for help. When tragedy struck a family, they came to the mosque asking why God allowed such suffering. My answers were always confident, because that was what an imam was expected to give. But inside, I often felt uncertain. Still, I pushed those feelings away, because my responsibility was not to question. My responsibility was to protect the faith. One afternoon, something happened that shook me more deeply than I expected. A young man named Hamza was brought before a small religious council at the mosque. He was only 19 years old, thin and nervous, with trembling hands. His father stood beside him, looking ashamed. The accusation against the boy was simple. He had been asking questions at the university about religion, about truth, about other beliefs. Some of his classmates claimed he had even read materials from outside Islam. The council members were angry. They believed his curiosity could spread doubt among other students. When they asked me to speak, and I stood slowly and looked at the young man, his eyes met mine, and for a moment I saw something I had not expected. Not rebellion, not arrogance, only confusion and fear. Hamza spoke quietly. "Sheikh, I only wanted to understand," he said. "I believe in God, but sometimes my heart is full of questions." The room grew silent. One of the older clerics slammed his hand on the table. "Questions like that lead people away from the truth," he said. "But they must be stopped before they spread." Everyone looked at me, waiting for my judgment. My position as Chief Imam meant my voice carried weight. I could feel the eyes of the council watching me, the father watching me, the young man watching me. And in that moment, something broke open inside me. Because I looked at Hamza and I saw myself at 19 years old, sitting with the same confusion, carrying the same questions, terrified to speak them aloud. I gave the expected response. I told Hamza that his questions were dangerous and that he must return to obedience and study under proper guidance. The council accepted my words. The father thanked me. Hamza lowered his eyes and nodded, but as they led him away, I sat back down and felt something I had not felt in years: shame. Not the shame of religious failure, the shame of a man who had just told a young person that his honest questions were a sin. That evening, I drove home slowly. The city moved around me, cars, the markets, the call to evening prayer echoing across the rooftops, but everything felt hollow. I sat alone in my study for a long time, staring at my bookshelves filled with volumes of theology and religious lore, and I thought about Hamza. I thought about myself. I thought about how many years I had spent answering questions I was afraid to truly ask. The night it happened was ordinary. I had spent the evening reviewing notes for a lecture I was scheduled to deliver at a regional conference. I was not ill, at least not in any way I recognized. I remember drinking tea at my desk, feeling slightly tired, and then a pain struck my chest so suddenly and so completely that I had no time to call for help. That was the last thing I remembered before the darkness came. What happened in that darkness is the reason I am speaking to you today. I am aware that many people will question what I am about to say. I am aware that there are explanations offered by medicine and science, and I do not dismiss them. But I also know what I experienced, and no explanation I have been given since has been able to remove it from my memory or my heart. I was in darkness, not the darkness of sleep or unconsciousness, but a darkness that felt alive and intentional, as though it was waiting for something. I had no body in the way I had known. I could not feel my hands or my feet, yet I was completely aware. I knew who I was. I knew what I had done with my life. And in that knowing, the weight of it came crashing over me. I saw my years of preaching, not the way I had remembered them, with pride and a sense of accomplishment, but the way they had truly been. I saw the faces of people I had frightened into obedience. I saw Hamza being led away with lowered eyes. I saw families who had come to me broken and left with rules instead of comfort. I saw the times I had used my authority to silence instead of to guide, and then I felt the weight of every moment with a clarity I had never known while living. Then something changed. In the distance, and I use the word distance only because I do not have a better one, there was light. Not light the way we know it, not sunlight or lamplight or anything I could compare to something I had seen on earth. It was a presence, and it was moving toward me, or I was moving toward it. I could not tell which. When it reached me, and I did not hear words the way we hear them through our ears, I received them, the way you might receive understanding when you suddenly grasp something you had been struggling with for years. The presence spoke to me, and what it communicated was not condemnation, it was recognition. It knew me completely, every buried question, every moment of hidden doubt, every time I had chosen fear over truth, and it did not reject what it saw. And what I understood in that moment was that everything I had taught about God had been built around distance and fear. But what I was encountering now was neither distant nor frightening. It was intimate, it was patient, and it was familiar in a way that made no sense because I had never felt it before in my life. The presence showed me things, not visions in the dramatic sense, but memories, moments from the Gospels that I had studied academically, the passages I had read but never truly considered. And in that space beyond death, those passages felt entirely different. They felt like answers to questions I had carried for 40 years. When I became aware of myself again, I was in a hospital. There were machines and tubes and the sound of monitors. My wife was beside me, her face pale and exhausted. A doctor was speaking, but I could not fully hear him. I was trying to hold on to what I had just experienced, and the way you try to hold on to a dream that is already fading. But this did not fade. It remained with me, clear and complete, as though it had been written into something deeper than memory. In the weeks that followed, my body recovered, but my mind and my heart were in a state I could not describe to anyone around me. I returned to the mosque after some time because what else was I to do? My role was still there. The expectations were still there, but everything felt different. And I stood at the pulpit and I looked out at the faces of the people who had come to hear me speak, and I thought about what I now knew, and I felt the distance between my inner world and the words I was expected to say, like a physical weight. I began to read the Gospels secretly at night. I had access to them as a scholar. Studying other religions was permitted for those who intended to refute them. I read them now not to refute them, but to understand. And in what I found was the same presence I had encountered beyond death, intimate, patient, full of a love that did not require performance. The process of what happened next was not sudden. It was slow and it was painful, and I will not pretend otherwise. I wrestled with every theological argument I had ever known. I tried to reconcile what I had experienced with the faith I had built my life upon. But the reconciliation was not possible, not because I stopped believing in God, but because what I had encountered beyond death and what I had been teaching for 30 years were fundamentally different. Eventually, I came to a moment of private decision. I knelt, not in the direction of prayer I had always known, but simply in the presence of the one who had met me in the darkness. And I surrendered. That word, surrender, had been central to my entire religious life. But this was different. This was not surrender to a system or a set of rules or the judgment of a community. This was surrender to a person, to the one who had known me completely and chosen not to condemn me. What followed that private moment was among the most difficult periods of my life. I could not announce what had happened. I could not explain it to my wife or my colleagues or my students. I carried this transformation alone, preaching words that no longer matched my heart, watching the faces of people who trusted me and knowing that I was no longer the man they believed they were listening to. The first person I told was a colleague from my university years, a man I had always considered thoughtful and fair. I chose my words carefully and explained only that I had experienced something during my cardiac event that had fundamentally changed my understanding of faith. His response was not what I had hoped. He became very still. And then he told me that what I was describing sounded like the work of deception, that near-death experiences had been documented as tricks of a weakened mind, and that I should seek guidance from a senior scholar before speaking of such things to anyone else. I never told him the full truth. Shortly after, I began making quiet arrangements. I reduced my public engagements, citing health reasons, which were at least partially true. I spent more time alone. I continued reading in secret, and I began reaching out, carefully and anonymously, through encrypted messages, to communities of people who had walked similar paths, those who had left Islam and found Christ, those who understood the specific gravity of what such a transition meant in a context like mine. Their testimonies became a lifeline. They helped me understand that what I had experienced was not unique, that others had encountered the same presence and had been transformed by it, and that the path ahead, though costly, was possible. The cost came quickly. When my absence from the mosque extended beyond what could be explained by health alone, questions began. When I declined to deliver a scheduled address at a regional conference, the whispers grew louder. And when a trusted colleague noticed a Bible among my books, not hidden well enough, the confrontation I had feared for months arrived. The meeting was private, in the home of one of the senior scholars in my city. But there were 4 men present besides myself, Men I had known for decades, men whose respect had once meant everything to me. They were not cruel. They were concerned, in the way that men are concerned when they believe someone they love has gone dangerously wrong. They asked me directly if the rumors were true. I had prepared myself for this moment many times. I had rehearsed careful deflections and partial truths. But when I sat in that room and looked at those 4 men, I found I could not use them. I told them the truth, not all of it, not the full account of what I had experienced beyond death, that I kept to myself, but the essential truth, that my faith had changed, that I now believed in Christ, and that I could not in good conscience continue in my role. The silence that followed was the longest I have ever sat inside. Then one of the men, the oldest among them, someone who had known my father, looked at me with an expression I will never forget. And it was not anger, it was grief. He said nothing for a long time, then he simply asked, "How?" I did not have an answer that would satisfy him. I still do not. What I had encountered beyond death was not transferable through argument. It was something that had to be received. I left the meeting knowing that my life as I had known it was over. The loss that followed was profound. My position at the mosque was quietly concluded with an official explanation of retirement due to health. And my reputation, built over 3 decades, unraveled in the private conversations of a community I could no longer be part of. Relationships that had defined my adult life fell away. Colleagues who had once sought my counsel stopped returning calls. Invitations went unanswered, and the social visits that had once filled my calendar disappeared. My family's reactions were painful and confusing. My brother refused to speak to me except to deliver stern warnings. My wife moved to another room in the house, avoiding conversation, and meals together became tense affairs filled with silent accusations. Yet amid the isolation and grief, I felt a strange sense of freedom. I no longer needed to pretend. I no longer needed to hide the truth that had been revealed to me beyond death. Even though the world around me seemed to crumble, a new reality began to form within my heart. I found a small Christian community online, where believers gathered in private groups to study the Bible, pray together, and support one another. Those meetings were virtual, but their impact on my life was profound. I felt, for the first time in decades, a sense of belonging, a spiritual family that nurtured my faith rather than imposing rules. I still feared discovery. Every conversation required caution. Every message needed encryption. I knew that if anyone from my old life discovered my interactions, I could face serious danger. Social and familial pressure in our society is intense and relentless. Yet the more I engaged with this new community, the stronger my faith became. I read the Gospels in secret and prayed quietly at night, asking God for guidance and protection. I began to understand the difference between performing religion and truly knowing God. I was no longer motivated by fear or the desire for respect, but by a genuine longing to walk in truth. One day, I received a message from an older man in the group, asking me if I was willing to share my testimony with a small online gathering. I hesitated. I knew what could happen if anyone outside the group learned my story. Yet deep inside, I felt a pull to speak openly, to declare who I now belonged to. I spent the night preparing my words, recalling the moments of darkness and the radiant light I had seen, the voice that had spoken my name, and the truth that had shattered the foundations of my old life. When the call began, I spoke slowly but with conviction. I recounted my encounter after death, the overwhelming presence of Jesus, the memories that were shown to me, and the weight of guilt I had carried for decades. I described the fear of discovery and the isolation that had followed my confession. I shared how I had found a new spiritual family online and the peace that was gradually replacing my grief. Listeners responded with empathy, encouragement, and prayer, and I realized that sharing my story was no longer dangerous within this safe space, but liberating. For the first time, I fully declared who I belonged to, without hesitation or compromise. A final confrontation came unexpectedly. Weeks later, an old colleague from the mosque contacted me privately. He demanded to know the truth about my conversion. He threatened to expose me to authorities if I did not recant. I felt the familiar pang of fear rising in my chest, but this time it was tempered by courage. I calmly explained that my faith was no longer bound by fear or tradition. I had encountered the truth beyond death, and nothing he could say or do would change that moment of revelation. The man ended the conversation abruptly, but the fear I had felt before did not return. I realized then that true faith carries its own protection, and that the love I had encountered was stronger than any threat. From that day forward, and I continued studying the Gospels in secret, praying, and connecting with my new spiritual family. Despite the losses, the betrayals, and the isolation, I had never felt closer to God. I understood fully, for the first time, the cost of truth and the freedom it brings. I had lost everything familiar, yet in that loss, I discovered a peace and a belonging I had never known. My life was no longer defined by titles or authority, but by faith and obedience to the one who had called my name beyond the darkness. Time passed, and the fear that had once ruled my life began to fade. Slowly, I found a new rhythm, guided not by the expectations of others, but by the truth I had encountered beyond death. I immersed myself in Scripture, studying the teachings of Jesus with care and devotion. I connected more deeply with my online Christian community. Their words, prayers, and encouragement became a lifeline that nurtured my faith. And every morning I woke with a sense of purpose. I prayed not out of obligation, but because I longed to speak to the God who had revealed himself to me when my heart had stopped. I began sharing my story more openly within safe spaces, offering testimony to those who were seeking answers in secrecy or who were afraid to question the beliefs they had grown up with. Each time I recounted the events I had witnessed beyond death, I felt my courage strengthen and my conviction deepen. My old life as a chief imam felt increasingly distant, but I did not mourn it entirely because it had brought me to the point where I could truly know God. I began to understand the profound difference between religion performed and faith experienced. I realized that obedience alone could not bring peace. Only relationship with Christ could provide the freedom I had long sought. My heart, once burdened by fear of shame, failure, and judgment, now carried a serenity I had never known. And I reflected on the lessons of my journey, the cost of following truth in a world filled with expectations and social pressures, the isolation that had once threatened to break me, the confrontation with family and colleagues. All of it had forged in me a resilience anchored in love. I could see now that everything I had endured had been necessary to lead me into the reality of God's mercy. The encounter with the radiant figure had not been an illusion nor a fleeting vision, and it was a call to live courageously and authentically. And as I shared my story, I watched others begin to understand that the truth cannot be buried forever. The words of Jesus I had read in secret were now alive in my heart, teaching me patience, forgiveness, and humility. I found myself praying for those who had once condemned me, for my faith seeking the light I had discovered to reach them as well. Slowly but surely, my soul began to heal. And the weight of guilt and fear that had haunted decades of my life lifted, and I could finally experience joy without pretense. I remembered the figure's words from beyond death. Remember, the truth will set you free. And I felt their truth resonate fully within me. I also realized that true freedom is not measured by titles, influence, or social standing. It is measured by the courage to embrace God's love, even when everything else seems lost. My story, once bound by secrecy and fear, had become a testament to the redemptive power of Christ, to those who were searching for answers and to anyone willing to hear. I understood now that leaving the life I knew, losing family, position, and reputation had been the cost of finding authentic peace. But that cost was nothing compared to the life of freedom I had gained. Today, I walk in that freedom with humility and gratitude. I am no longer defined by the expectations of men, but by the mercy of God and the grace of Jesus Christ. And I have discovered a new spiritual family who nurtures my faith and understands my journey. I close by urging anyone listening to search sincerely for truth. Fear may whisper in your ear, social pressure may weigh upon you, and loss may loom. But the path of truth leads to a peace and freedom that no worldly title can provide. My hope is that my testimony encourages you to seek beyond appearances, to the God who waits patiently to reveal himself to those who are willing to listen and believe. And the darkness I experienced after death was terrifying, yet necessary, because it led me to the light that now guides every step of my life. I no longer fear loss, because I have gained something infinitely greater. The love, the mercy, and the presence of Jesus Christ have transformed me completely, and in him I am finally free.